Ahead and start the recording, and I'll go into the official welcome for those who will be watching the recording of this, and we will begin. So welcome again. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending to all of you, depending on where in the world you are joining us from today, and welcome to this first of 14 learning sessions in Pacifica Extension's graduate certificate in contemporary analytical psychology and Neo-Jungian studies. I'm Laura Lee Scott, Senior Director of Pacifica Extension, and I'm thrilled to welcome each of you to this course that aligns with Pacifica Graduate Institute's commitment to making depth psychology more accessible, while also addressing both the existential and real-world challenges of an ongoing mental health crisis, a climate crisis, and social justice traumas and inequities. There's a lot that I'm excited about with this course for a lot of reasons. Not only are you going to be learning from and working with world-recognized authorities in analytical psychology, most of whom scholarship continues to shape the contours and influence the trajectory of Jungian psychoanalytic work, but also in the way this course was designed, and I'll get to that in a minute. Each learning session will illuminate the ways in which Jungian psychology speaks to real-world challenges and an evolving understanding of cultural complexes and a pluralistic psyche. I am deeply, deeply grateful for the collaboration and partnership with Dr. Stefano Carpani, who is the course designer and creator. Stefano, I'm sure many of you are familiar with him and his prolific body of work, but he is a psychoanalyst with a private practice in Berlin. Among other things, he's the editor of Breakfast at Kusnacht, The Plural Turn in Jungian and Post-Jungian Studies, the Anthology of Contemporary Classics in Analytical Psychology, Individuation and Liberty in a Globalized World. We could go on and on, but Stefano, thank you, because this course was his creation, and it has been a wonderful and creative time of collaborating with him to bring this together with Pacifica Graduate Institute and Pacifica Extension. Stefano, would you like to say a few words of welcome?
I would like to welcome everyone. I find it unbelievable that we are 100, we sold out, so I want to thank you. When I shared my idea with you, you said, let's look into it. And now, 9 months after, we're doing it and we sold out. I want to thank Dr. Lee, who is with us. I want to thank the provost, Dr. Deus Combi. So I really look forward to be with you. And it's so beautiful to have George Jorgensen, one of the new ancestors, as I call them, to tell us more about the Freud-Jung relationship. So good luck, enjoy. And if you want to touch base with me, not because of administration reason, because we have a teaching assistant here, but for any other reason, you can write me an email and you can find my email online. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. And yes, as Stefano said, we have both the CEO and president. I'm thrilled and honored to have the CEO and president of Pacifica Graduate Institute on with us. Dr. Lee, there's so many on, I can't find you in the boxes, but would you like to unmute and say a few words of welcome to everyone?
I'm right here, Laura Lee. Can you see me?
You are, yes.
Good morning, everyone. Stefano, it's good to see you again. I saw you last week during your conference. It's good to see you, and it's good to see some familiar faces this morning on our screen. As Laura Lee mentioned, I am in my second academic year at Pacifica Graduate Institute as our president and CEO. And Pacifica is the essential institution to meet this moment. We're a pioneer of inclusive learning, as evidenced in your participation in this course. And I want to let you know that I am learning alongside with you. So I'm not only here to give the welcome this morning, but I'll be learning alongside with you throughout the next couple of months. Pacifica is 47 plus years old. We're soulful, innovative, embodying the curiosity, kindness, and ambition of our growing learning community. And we believe that making depth psychology education or research and services accessible and affordable to everyone is the most important thing we can do for higher education I'm in the county of Santa Barbara. So Santa Barbara, the Central Coast, California, the future of America, and for the soul of the world. And I am so excited about where we're going as an institution, as it really sets the tone for what's to come, not only for America, but for the world. We're not here to answer all the world's problems or to solve all the world's problems, but we're certainly here to stay true to our motto of tending soul of and in the world. So welcome to the course, and I look forward to learning with you and from you. Thanks, Laura Lee.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. And I think it's just a testament to Pacifica's genuine commitment to real learning that we have so many of our administration and Pacifica faculty on for this course. So thank you all for your commitment to that. One last introduction. Let me also introduce you to your amazing teaching assistant for this course, Gelare Coy. Just a little bit about Gelare. You see her with the hat on and smiling and waving. Gelare was born in Iran. She is an artist, writer, and scholar. She holds a BFA in Painting and Art History from the San Francisco Art Institute, along with 2 master's degrees in depth psychology from Pacifica, where she's currently completing her doctoral studies. So Gelare, thank you so much for the wonderful job you're going to be doing supporting our learners and our faculty in this course. If you have any questions regarding the learning platform that may be new to some of you, D2L, or this course in general, please reach out to Gelare. I believe you've been given her email in your learning resource guide. Gelare, you can go ahead and type it in the chat bar as well. And now, and finally, let me introduce you to today's faculty presenter, Dr. George Hoganson. George is a senior training analyst at the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago. He holds a PhD in philosophy from Yale University and an MA in clinical social work from the University of Chicago. He is the past vice president of the International Association for Analytical Psychology and a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Analytical Psychology. He's the author of Jung's Struggle with Freud, and along with Thomas Kirsch, he's the editor of the Red Book, Reflections on C.G. Jung's Liber Novus. His numerous papers on archetypal theory, the nature of symbolism, and synchronicity have contributed to reshaping thinking on these subjects within analytical psychology. He lives in Illinois and maintains a private practice in Chicago. And George, you are going to begin at the beginning with us today with his presentation on the Jung-Freud debate and the foundations of analytical psychology. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much. Can everyone, am I coming through clearly on the audio? All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm very, very pleased to be here and very honored that Stefano asked me to do this first lecture, this first presentation. Stefano and I have had quite a few opportunities to deal with one another, and I certainly applaud his entrepreneurship, creating programs like this and many other things that he's been involved with. I also have a fairly long history with Pacifica over the years, and it's a pleasure to be back working with Pacifica on a program such as this. What I want to do today, and I don't know how exactly we'll fare with this because there's a large group of people involved. I do like to try for discussions, and what I think I'm going to do is see if I can get some kind of a gallery here where I can see at least some of the folks who are involved. There are 4 screens from what I see, so that's going to be a little tricky to manage, but we'll do our best. As Laura Lee mentioned, in the last few years, the vast majority of my own work on Jung has been rather theoretical material on things like complex dynamic systems theory, synchronicity, the theory of archetypes. But when Stefano asked me if I would make a presentation for this, I thought that I would go back to my earliest work, which is now roughly 50 years ago that I became involved with studying the relationship between Jung and Freud. And the reason for doing that is I really do think that it's very important to be clear on what some of the distinctions are between these two founders of depth psychology before one moves too far into the new developments that are taking place in what Stefano and others have called Neo-Jungian studies or post-Jungian studies. Actually, I guess we're post-Jungian studies or something in some degree. So I thought it was worthwhile for us to go back to the beginnings and draw some critical distinctions between these two extraordinary theoreticians. There's a very fine scholar at the University of Essex, David Henderson, who once remarked to me that psychoanalysis only really existed when Jung and Freud were collaborating with one another. And it's an interesting point of view. And David's argument there was that when the two of them were actually trying to collaborate with one another, they had the opportunity to perhaps create a complete system of psychology. They, of course, fell apart in around 1913 for reasons that we can discuss here today. And in some degree, psychoanalysis fell apart at the same time. Now, Freud kept things under control within the psychoanalytic movement. Jung went off and created analytical psychology. I have my own point of view on this, that over time, psychoanalysts, particularly once Freud left the scene in 1939, psychoanalysis began to gradually gravitate in the direction of analytical psychology without knowing that they were doing that. I'll try and explain to you why that might be a point of view to take on the history of psychoanalysis. But to get started with this, of course, I suspect most of you know perfectly well what some of the very early elements of the relationship between Jung and Freud may have been. There was about a 20-year difference in their ages. Freud had started out as a neurologist, had spent a great deal of time studying the nervous system of things like sea urchins and so on. Jung, of course, started out as a psychiatrist at the Bergholzli, and they came into contact with one another in 1906 when they exchanged the first letters between the two of them. That relationship lasted until 1913, 1912, 1913, breaking up over a period of 2 or 3 years. So now the video that I sent out to everyone was exclusively focused on the nature of the unconscious. And I'm curious whether there are ambiguities, questions, or other responses to simply the question of the distinctions that existed around the unconscious for these two in the video that I put together that we need to clear up before we get started. And then what I'm going to do with the rest of our time is lay out a few very critical distinctions in the way that they viewed psychological phenomena, beginning very early on in the relationship, and in fact, virtually at the first exchange of letters, and get those on the table, and then we can perhaps have some discussion. Although I'm a little concerned about discussion with so many people, it's wonderful. Are there questions, though? If you can put up, we've got the hand capability down here, I think. Are there issues that need clearing up there? Yes, Karen?
Hi there. This is a general question. I would like to learn more. Towards the end of your presentation, you gave some examples of sort of things happening in the animal world which kind of, I guess you're saying, sort of mirrors some of the processes of the psyche. And I was curious, do you have any recommendations for reading to further explore that? I'm very interested. I'm a nature therapist. I do ecotherapy as well as traditional therapy. And there's so much overlap here that I really would like to explore more. So if at any point you can add that, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, let me just say a word about why that stuff comes in there, and that may help, and then we can perhaps return to it. I'm going to make notes so that I don't lose track of some of this. Those examples, I think that in the slide set that I had there, I have to confess that's one of the worst experiences of my life, was putting together that video. I went through it. I did an entire video, which I was very, very pleased with, and then found out that my microphone was turned off. So this was a repetitive problem. Okay.
Sorry about that, George. I think that might be a Jungian thing, Jungians in technology. So welcome to the archetypal field.
Right, right. Exactly. So I was talking, of course, in those videos about the role of Henri Bergson in this entire in the development of Jung's theories about the unconscious. And this is an area that hasn't been there have been a couple of papers written about this. John Howell, who just died a couple of weeks ago, wrote an important paper, two important papers on the origin of the theory of archetypes in the French psychological world. Pierre Genet, William James, and then there was this fellow, Conway Lloyd Morgan. Conway Lloyd Morgan, but they were all, Conway Lloyd Morgan was a comparative psychologist in England. In other words, he was working primarily on animal behavior. But he was very heavily influenced by Bergson. Genet and Theodore Flournoy were close friends of Bergson. But Bergson in 1907 wrote a book called Creative Evolution, which was an extraordinarily influential book at that point. And Jung picked up on it, but it's sometimes described as the most important philosophical work of that period. And Bergson became a world-renowned philosopher. Bergson, however, was critical of Darwinian theory, but not. I'm sorry. I can go on digressions down into these things, and I'll try and be brief. There were more controversies about Darwinism between in the late 19th and early 20th century than most people realize at this point. And there were reasons for that, because Darwin's theory was really quite incomplete. He didn't have a sound theory of transmission of biological. He didn't have the gene theory, basically. And this caused a lot of controversy around Darwinism until Mendel's gene theory came into the picture, and they joined that up with Darwin, and then you get the so-called standard model of evolutionary theory. So this wasn't an opposition to Darwin in some kind of religious fundamentalist sense or anything else, but there was a lot of work going on around alternative ways of thinking about evolution. And Bergson came into that picture. And one of the sources of the material that he was using were French natural scientists, particularly a man by the name of Fabre, who was an entomologist and studying these peculiar insect behaviors. Conway Lloyd Morgan was another one. And Jung drew on both Bergson and Lloyd Morgan. If you read through the collected works, you'll see footnotes to Conway Lloyd Morgan's animal behavior examples. what was really important about that for our talk about our thinking about the nature of the unconscious in Jung's world is this idea that, as Bergson puts it, in the case of the wasp that stings the caterpillar, the wasp does not know the caterpillar in the way that an entomologist would know the caterpillar. The wasp knows the caterpillar from within. Now that notion that that knowledge does not derive from an objective external view of another entity plays a role in Jung. I'm doing a paper right now that I have to give next week at Essex University on Jung and Bion. I'm convinced it comes into Bion's thinking, although he doesn't have the same sources for it, although he does draw on Bergson. So what Jung would be saying, and I think this might play a role in eco-psychology, for example, is what does it mean to know from within the system rather than objectively from outside of the system? And we'll see if we can get into a little bit more of this, but you see it shifts the center of gravity for observation. And it shifts the center of gravity for observation in psychology. So in the early history of psychoanalysis, for example, when Freud starts talking about the transference, he wants to keep it entirely that the transference comes from the patient to the analyst. It's actually Jung who comes along, and it's really Jung who introduces the idea of a countertransference, for example, that the analyst also has a transference that is significant to the analytic process going towards the patient. Now you have the beginnings of this idea that you'll find in people like Thomas Ogden of the constitution of the third, the relationship, the mutuality of the relationship between analyst and analysand that creates an interactive field that is no longer working in the way in which an observing analyst watching the patient, working with the patient from a distance. They're now integrated with one another. But Jung makes the remark in the Tavistock lectures, I can't really tell a person much about their personal unconscious. And then he has this very interesting expression, but when I am him, then I can engage with the process. Now, that's a very peculiar way of thinking about it, but that's the clinical application of this idea of the sympathy between the wasp and the caterpillar, for example. I can give you, if not today, I can also give you some more source material on eco-psychology. One of my colleagues, Dennis Merritt, does a lot of work in that field, and I think he might be worth looking into. I'm going to stop now. This is, please stop me. Otherwise you'll get me on one subject and I'll go on for the entire hour and a half, okay?
I'll stop you, George.
Does that help make sense of your question? A little bit of how Jung draws on these animal examples. He has a lot of them. It does seem as though this really matters to him in terms of, you see, when I don't know how the presentation on archetypes will go along these lines, but there's a way of looking at the notion of archetypes is really in a sense, universal structural patterns that should pertain to all levels of existence, you might say. So the behavior of these animals is a kind of example in Jung's mind of how the archetype works.
You were talking, George, asking the question about the differences between Jung's and Freud's views on the unconscious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I'm just asking, there was a question about how these things fit together from the presentation that I gave. See, it's the reason I put that video together was that this is an area that's frequently not understood at the very beginning of thinking about analytical psychology and psychoanalysis, is that Jung and Freud had, frankly, very, very different presuppositions about the nature of the unconscious. They come out of very different traditions. As Deleuze says in that one quotation that I used in the video, Jung comes out of this tradition that goes back to Leibniz, and it was much more the established way of thinking about the unconscious. And the fact of the matter is, Freud comes along with a very distinctive and frankly idiosyncratic way of thinking about the unconscious as this repository of repressed materials. Now, I'm going to talk more about repression and projection, but it's important to understand that one of the problems that Freud was early on in particular, was constantly complaining about how people didn't understand his theories. And he kind of wanted to make it out that it was because of the people objected to the sexual theory of the origin of neuroses. What a lot of the physicians that he spoke to really had a problem with was figuring out repression. It didn't quite make sense to other physicians. And frankly, one of the things that connected Freud and Jung very early on, and we'll talk about this again in just a moment. I am going to switch to some slides that will organize this a little, was that Jung's work with the word association test seemed to sort of indicate that repression actually existed and that it could be demonstrated experimentally. And this was very important for Freud in terms of promoting his idea of repression as a fundamental mechanism. The thing is it wasn't quite what either one of them thought in terms of the relationship between Jung's work and Freud's work. So you have this idea that what Deleuze refers to as the differential unconscious coming out of the tradition from Leibniz through German Romanticism. You have Freud with this structural understanding of the unconscious as in this early period of his development as a sort of place, a psychic location where repressed material is dropped into or pushed into. And these were two very different points of view. Are there any other hands up or some? Yes, we've got a hand up over here.
Yes, Prashant, go ahead and ask your question.
Yes.
Hello there. Thank you for letting me have the opportunity of posing this question. So, Doctor,
Yes.
you mentioned earlier something about, if I understood your question well, you mentioned something about two aspects or two parts of the unconscious, correct? So,
Go ahead with your question.
so did you mean by any chance, were you pointing at the two aspects as presented to us by Dr. Jung, meaning the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious? Was it that you were referring to?
No, well, it depends on whether you're talking about Jung or Freud. Freud has this repository idea. Now, Jung has two. You're correct that Jung talks about the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. Now, one of the things that I will one of the issues that can arise here is that we take this spatial metaphor that Freud uses, which is that it's a metaphor, but basically that the unconscious is a location where certain things are stored, repressions are stored, you have to be careful about transposing that spatial metaphor without clarification to Jung's theory of the unconscious, personal unconscious, and collective unconscious. It's fairly easy, and people, I don't want to make too big a thing out of this, because we have to, we think and speak with metaphors, right? So we're always going to be slipping into that area, but it's not entirely correct to say that there's the personal unconscious as sort of one box, and the collective unconscious is another box, and they're either connected to one another, or the collective unconscious is below the personal unconscious, when in fact what you have is much more of a continuum. And these elements intersect with one another in ways that aren't confined to a sort of spatial metaphor. So you will have, we'll talk in a couple minutes here about the theory of the complex, for example. So Jung, the complex. Let me pull up some slides here. I don't know if this will. Well, so pardon me. Organize my thought on this. So the complex is a very personal element in an individual's psychology. Okay. We have complexes because of our own experience of something happening, referred to broadly as a trauma, but I'll clarify that a little bit. So a person can have a mother complex because of the relationship that developed around their experience of their mother. Okay. So that's part of the personal unconscious. All right. That sounds an awful lot like Freud's repressed material. Okay. However, Jung will say, but the complex contains an archetypal core. So the personal mother complex will nevertheless have some element that connects into the archetypal mother, which is collective unconscious. So these elements are linked to one another in a very critical way. Why critical? So someone comes into your office, a clinical office, and you start talking about the problems they had with their mother or their father or some other, and you'll find out, and you'll begin to see the complex constellating, the energy around that complex developing. But at some point along the way, you might, the clinician, the analyst might begin to sort of feel that there's aspects of the way this person experienced their mother that don't seem to quite line up with a real human being. Begins to take on qualities of experience that are bigger, you might say, more powerful, more numinous. There are ways, and that's a clue that you're beginning to go through the complex into the archetypal. You see? So it's not like you're moving from box A to box B. You're moving down this continuum of the unconscious increasingly towards the archetypal. Although you may have started out talking about the relationship with the mother. So these elements of the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious are not quite so easily distinguished from one another as the language makes it sound you could do. Does that make sense? Does that?
Right. Well, actually, again, frankly, you quite provided a more depth explanation than I was expecting.
Sorry about that.
I also simply wanted, first of all, the concept of collective psyche is totally through my head. I don't quite get that, but it was the way you were explaining. I was trying to make some links there. However, I also wanted to know that the personal, if we only focus on the personal unconscious, would you say the personal unconscious as explained by Dr. Jung is more or less the same as by Dr. Freud, or one of those two has somewhat better explanation?
No, they're not. There's some similarities, for one thing, but they're really quite distinct from one another. Jung hardly ever uses the word repression, for example. One of the distinctions that I draw, and if you've had any of you have had the opportunity to look at my book on Jung and Freud, I go into this in some detail, is that there's an important distinction between repression and projection in the way in which the psyche operates for these two. Jung, once he's, and in fact, even during the relationship with Freud, he hardly ever uses the idea of repression.
Mm-hmm.
He will talk about material in the personal unconscious that, and he'll use expressions like, well, we just, there are the things we don't want to think about, or that we have forgotten, which is a very different way of looking at what goes on in the personal unconscious than what Freud thought about with the theory, with the notion of repression, which is a much more elaborate. And this is precisely why Freud had a hard time convincing people of that repression was a real phenomenon. So right from the beginning, we have a distinction in that degree.
Mm-hmm.
It also is very important, and we can talk about this. Probably don't. I'm not sure that the slides would help in any way. So let me talk for a moment here, getting back into the history of the relationship between the two of them, about the significance of the word association test. Okay. Back into the 19th century, there had been an experimental project of studying the way in which people made associations between words. It starts in England and comes up into psychological research, experimental research around 1900 in Germany and Switzerland and so on. When Jung got to the Berg-Holzli Hospital, psychiatric hospital, after he finished his doctoral degree, Eugen Bleuler put him to work, amongst many other things, working with the word association test. Now, the way that the test had been conducted up to that point was they'd have a list of words, and mainly they were just studying the way in which people made associations. So they were really just looking at they would give a person a stimulus word and find out what the reaction word was, but it didn't go much beyond that. Jung made some enormously important innovations in applying the word association test. He developed galvanic skin response machinery, pulmonary measures, breathing rates, and so on, so that he developed a very elaborate analytic process for studying the affective, the emotional component of the responses that people had. He also, along with a couple of his colleagues, Ricklin and a couple of others, did an enormous number of these tests on what they would call normals, on hysterics, on people who were under the influence of alcohol, people who hadn't slept, families, to see how family responses, some of his work on families, he can show how daughters and mothers have corresponding response phenomena to these things and so on. But they all had to do with, these are all measures of affect, the emotional reaction to the stimulus word. And what he began to see was that there would, in some instances, be very pronounced delays, changes in galvanic skin response, etc., that marked a particular stimulus word as having a much stronger emotional impact on the person. Now, by this time, this is around 1904, 1905, and so on. He's already reading Freud. He'd read The Interpretation of Dreams in 1900 when it first came out. And he's very interested in Freud's methods. So, in fact, if any of you have seen the movie A Dangerous Method, probably the only really accurate part of that movie is the administration of the word association test, which is quite. They actually found the original machinery that that Jung had built in the Berg-Holzli for the movie, but so he's getting this information on these complexes. This is where the complex comes in, the individual's complex. This is a way of measuring the presence of a complex, is you get this emotional deviation. I want to keep in mind that the original way that Jung referred to complexes was the feeling-toned complex. The feeling-toned complex. The complexes have a feeling tone. They have an emotional character. They are characterized by their emotional impact on the person. So what Jung would do was he would start, he thought he was kind of implementing Freud's way of working with these things. And he would sit down with the person and start talking with them about why is this particular word having the emotional impact on you that it does. And he found that usually within a fairly short period of time, they could unpack why the person was having that reaction to it. Now, just by itself, that is a not inconsequential problem here, because he's taking for the Freud-Jung relationship, because Jung is basically taking the individual at their word after he works with them for a while about why does this word have the emotional stimulus that it does. Now, to over caricature perhaps Freud, that would never be good enough for Freud, because Freud has this idea that the psychoneuroses all rest on sexuality. Now that I'm somewhat oversimplifying, but Jung will sit down and for example, there's one of the we have in his published works on the word association test, we have some of the responses. For example, there's one in there where a person has an unusually long response to the word knife. Now, he doesn't exactly play out the entire interview, but you know, if you said sat down with this person, well, why is knife such a big thing? And the person, after some period of excavation, because it is hidden, it's something you don't want to, you've pushed it into the personal unconscious. But at some point, the person, well, you know, my older brother came at me with a knife once, and it was terrifying. Well, Freud would not be satisfied with that, because the knife is obviously a phallic image. And you'd have to get this, you know, and I'm caricaturing, okay, but it would eventually have to come around to that position. So there's a distinction already here in the way in which they're approaching neurotic phenomena. And Jung writes to Freud, in fact, he writes to Freud in one of the very first letters from Jung to Freud, and he says, I have it in the slides that let me see. I don't know if let me pull these up for a minute here. See if I can read that for you, if I can find it. All right. Here are our heroes. Let me see if I can find this quotation. I think I have it in here. Okay. He writes to I'm going to stop that. He writes to Freud and says, here we go. Yeah. Well, he writes to Freud and says, don't you think it's possible that it's not just sexuality? Don't you think that it's possible that it could be something like hunger in a child? Okay. And Freud writes back and says, no, you don't understand, but I'm sure that if you work with me for a while, you'll realize that it's sexuality. And right there, they've got one of the biggest problems between the two of them. Now, what is Jung saying here? And he goes on to talk about this further on, and this is the debate over libido. If you read a lot of the literature critical of Jung after the break with Freud, you'll find the Freudians saying, well, it's because he couldn't accept the idea of the sexual nature of the libido. One would really have to clarify that, the exclusive sexual nature of libido. So what's he actually saying in this? He's looking at the infant, for example. Jung says, look, if we look at the infant nursing at the breast, do we really want to call that a sexual experience just because it looks like a sexual experience in an adult? And Freud basically wants to get all perceived experiences of pleasure lumped together into the sexual model. Jung is saying all the way along, no, we can disaggregate this notion of libido so that the psychic energy of the infant nursing is different from the psychic energy of the adolescent or the adult engaging in sexual behavior. So coming out of the word association test, and partly because of the way he's thinking, he's thinking about how things go in and out of the unconscious, he's altering the understanding of libido and the understanding of psychic energy. And you add later on, after he's done the work on the Red Book, you begin adding the collective unconscious into this process, and you get another flow of energy coming from that level of the system. So we have right from the very beginning a dispute between the two of them now over the nature of libido, the interpretation of phenomena at different age levels. And this is what you would call in an experimental setting an attribution error. Jung is basically saying to Freud, you are making an attribution error. You're attributing an adult phenomena to the child. And it is not appropriate to make that connection. Question right below me.
Rollis.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, could it be that Freud is sold on his his sexual attribution to the issues, because it seems to me the only, or it seemed to him to be the only clearly physical changes. It was a developmental theory that Freud had, that it was sexual, whereas I think Jung's objection was that you lose the numinous when you attribute, for example, when you're so focused on the physical, the numinous life of the human person just disappears in all of that, and there's no recognition of some mysterious development that's occurring, whereas Freud wants to bring it all into a perfectly rational scientific explanation in a developmental sense. So, and yet Jung has never really, except for differentiation, it doesn't seem as if he really has given any thorough developmental theory. I mean, he can't, because he wants to leave the mystery and the wholeness of the person. So I've seen some Jungians seem to look at some of the other developmental theorists more, like Sullivan, for example, or someone who is a little more a little broader, a little more
Well, yeah,
I guess that's enough of my question. I hope it's a question. Thank you.
You've opened up several issues here, and it will allow me, it'll allow us to start talking about which I want to get to. Another very important distinction between Jung and Freud, which is the distinction between the sign and the symbol. That's the way Jung would phrase it. We'll get back to that in just a moment here. But on the developmental side of things, okay, this was precisely why Michael Fordham in England became so involved with Melanie Klein. And in fact, the first Jungian society outside of the Zurich group was the Society for Analytical Psychology in London. And this was established by Michael Fordham, who was one of the singular giants of the early years of analytical psychology. And he basically said what you were saying: we don't really have a very good developmental model here. Let's look around and see if we can find something. And Fordham felt, and there's a very good reason to agree with this, that Melanie Klein sounded surprisingly Jungian to him. And as I said at the very beginning, when you get to looking at the history of psychoanalysis, once Freud is no longer laying down the law about exactly what is and is not psychoanalysis, a lot of the schools of psychoanalysis, the object relations people, the Kohutians, and so on, begin to gradually move, without acknowledging it, and usually without knowing it, in directions that sound increasingly Jungian. And this has become quite pronounced in the last few years. So within the world of analytical psychology, there is this subgroup, the so-called developmental group, which draws heavily on in the British version at the SAP, heavily on Melanie Klein. One of the, and I'm being unquestionably partisan here, one of the interesting distinctions between the Jungians and the psychoanalysts is that you get most Jungian analysts know an awful lot of the psychoanalytic literature, not just the developmental, but we all read the psychoanalytic literature. It's very difficult until recently to find psychoanalysts who read the Jungian literature. because Jung, after the break with Freud, there's an interesting little book by Christine Gallant, Gallant, called Taboo Jung, which I think is one of the best treatments of this. It's a little book, but Jung became, in her rendering, and I think she's exactly correct, eventually became literally a taboo figure. In other words, you could not touch Jung if you were a psychoanalyst. And I can go on about that, which I won't digress into that world, but it is the case. So, but your question, your larger question about the numinous and so on, will bring us into this question of the distinction between the sign and the symbol and how they play a role. This is a critical distinction, again, that Jung draws in when he begins to comment on the distinctions between Jung and Freud. Yeah, that they had.
Thanks, George. There is a
Yeah.
question in the chat as well.
If
you wanted to get to it.
There's 99 things in the chat.
Yeah, there was a specific one though that I think is interesting. Let me just see if I can find it. Oh, Nick says, I understand the spatial metaphor of Freud's structural model of the unconscious,
Yeah.
but I'm confused about the meaning of the differential unconscious.
Well,
What does
the
differential mean?
idea here is that if we go back to Leibniz, which is really the starting point for a lot of this, and I don't know how clear I was in the video presentation, but Leibniz, and it comes up through Immanuel Kant and others, but what Leibniz is looking at here, and it's a philosophical argument on Leibniz's part, but basically, in order to get Leibniz's metaphysics going, he has the way that he has this idea, the theory of the monad, which I won't try to go into depth on, but it's in a manner of speaking, it is a theory of consciousness, and it's graduated along a continuum. That let's put it this way without going too deep into the metaphysics, every entity in the world consists of monads. And each monad contains within itself an entire representation of the world writ large, the whole shebang is present in every, so it's basically, you can begin to get a panpsychism out of this, but leave that aside for a minute. So if the monad that inheres in a stone on the beach has in that monad is a complete representation of the entire universe. It is entirely there. The thing is that the stone has essentially no conscious element to it. Now, the distinction there that Leibniz draws is between perception and apperception, as I discussed in the video. Perception encompasses the entire universe. Apperception encompasses what is available to consciousness. And this language, this distinction between perception and apperception, runs all the way up, and including to Jung. He uses that same language. God, at the other end of the continuum, apperceives everything. So the consciousness of God encompasses the entire universe. And in between God and the stone on the beach, you have a range of different levels of consciousness. As the monad increases in its apperception, of what the universe allows for perception. So that distinction means that there's a continuum again that moves through to increase its range, the range of consciousness, you might say. Now, it may sound like we've got a somewhat of a spatial notion here, but now your differentiation is between what is conscious and what is unconscious by virtue of its being outside the boundaries of consciousness, outside the reach of consciousness. So, you know, you can even think about when you get to people like Huxley using the expression, the doors of perception or whatever it is, the bounds of sense, things like that. There's an important book on Kant that is called the bounds of sense. What are the boundaries of sense? Now, for Jung, this is jumping ahead a little bit, but for Jung, the project of psychic growth is to extend the range of apperception, to extend the range of consciousness further and further into that dimension, that differentiated dimension of unconsciousness. So instead of segregating conscious from unconscious, which is basically what Freud does with his model, Jung is saying we've got this continuum, and in fact, you can move further and further out in that continuum. Now we begin to get into numinous things. If consciousness can move towards the archetypal, and the archetypal can move into consciousness, that is where you begin to get the so-called numinous experiences. Is when we approach those dimensions that are further out on the continuum. Now, contemporary work, the most interesting. This goes through a series of changes in Jung's own thinking. And I want to very carefully, I don't know how my colleague is going to talk about archetypes, and I think it's the next session. There's been about a 20-25 year argument going on in the Jungian community about what are we talking about when we talk about archetypes, and I'm not going to digress deeply into that. I've been kind of in the middle of that for the entire time. But one of the things about looking at how Jung develops over time in his own growth is Jung is really looking. Jung, just at a personal level, Jung was very concerned that he retain his status as a scientist. It just meant a lot to him. And he was very worried about being classified as a woolly-headed mystic, which got a lot worse after the break with Freud. So Jung is frequently, we frequently find Jung sort of trying very hard to sound scientific as science is classified at any given time. So the early theory, the early language around archetypes, for example, is frequently quite biological. Now, I mentioned earlier on that he was really drawing on Bergson's creative evolution, not on Darwin so much, which is part of why there's some confusion about this in the scholarship on archetypes. By the end of his life, in the last 20 years roughly, he's doing a lot more work with Wolfgang Pauli, and he's gotten into the quantum mechanics side of trying to reframe his theories in relation to quantum mechanics. Of course, he's also been working through the alchemical material at that point. So you get to something like Mysterium Conjunctionis and the theory of the unus mundus and the whole discussion of psychoid and so on, and you've got a different kind of theory being developed. Let me say a word about psychoid, because it's another term that you will run into in Jung, and you will run into it in commentaries on Jung. And it goes to this question of what is the relationship between the individual and the unconscious, the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious, and so on. Just to clarify this word, and it evolves for Jung over time. It's one of those things that does change. Going all the way back to Descartes, you know, poor old Descartes. If we didn't have him, we'd have to invent him just to have someone to kick around in philosophy classes as having, you know, messed everything up. But basically, of course, Descartes separates mind from body. Everybody has heard that. So that the mind is one thing, the body is another thing, and from that point on, a big chunk of philosophy is trying to figure out how to get these things to communicate with one another. And that makes up the history of philosophy from 1650 to the present almost, is how do we get consciousness and body to connect to one another? In the late 19th century, there was a biologist by the name of Hans Driesch who said, well, how about if there's a there's a third in here that I'm going to call psychoid, which is a sort of melding of the psychological and the physical. And he brings this idea in, and it becomes very popular, particularly in German circles. Driesch did some very important work on embryology that seemed to sort of support some of this idea. And so it comes into the vocabulary and they start working with it, but it's initially just an idea about how mind and body connect to one another. Now, over time, Jung picks up on it. Jung is using it. Euler's using it. It's a widespread concept in German psychology and biology. But over time for Jung, it enlarges and enlarges and enlarges in terms of its scope, because Jung's thinking about the relationship between mind and matter also expands over time, and particularly when he starts working with Pauli and they get into the idea that quantum mechanics might be the basis of thinking about the psyche. And this is being pursued most actively right now by Harold Ottmansbacher, who is a physicist in Zurich. He does a lot of teaching at the Jung Institute there. He's written quite a bit of very important material on this. But you get to that point, going back to this idea of the differential unconscious and the unus mundus, which is this unified, singular, underlying, undifferentiated in the sense that it's neither mind nor body, it's psychoid. Very much like Leibniz's idea about the unconscious becomes prominent in Jung's thinking. That's at the end of his career. So to go to the question, what is a differentiated unconscious? It is this continuum that differentiates along the way between conscious and unconscious, rather than being segmented into components. How are we doing on time?
We only have about
I can hang. I'm perfectly happy to hang around, but as you will see, once I get started on talking on something, I tend to go on a bit.
Yeah, George, everybody in the chat is really curious to see the slide presentations and the presentation that you had prepared.
Well, I gotta find it. Gotta find the right one. I'm sorry to be glitchy about the technology here, but let me. Something went wrong here. This is not right.
Do you have that PowerPoint presentation you had
Well,
made?
this is all that I. This is not what I. Just hold on a second. Give me a moment.
Okay.
This is material. This is the material that you saw, plus some extra stuff. Let me see if I can get the just.
Maybe while you're doing that, I can just let everybody know that everyone should have received a welcome email from Pacifica after you signed up for the course. There's a lot of important information in that email, so it would be really worthwhile if you could read it thoroughly. There'll be login information for you to log in to Desire to Learn, which is D2L. It's Pacifica's learning platform. You can find the link to that in the quick links on the Pacifica website. When you first log on the far right, there's quick links and you scroll down and it says D2L. You will log in and then click on the course and you'll find a lot of information there in the learning modules. Each of the presenters has their own learning module, and the videos, any reading materials, and the question discussions and the prompt questions and everything are in there. We're going to also send you a instructional video very soon on how to navigate D2L. So in the meantime, you also have my email. So if you have any confusion or questions, you can reach out to me during the week, okay? I'll also send a lot of information to you after this session. So what do you say, George? Did you find it?
I believe so.
Okay.
So now I had to quickly add some slides. For some reason, they had dropped out. I want to go here. To, okay, so I'm going to, I mentioned the letter to Freud. I'm going to do this and not in the full presentation mode, okay? Because I just.
That's
So
okay. This looks fine.
This is the letter. This is the October 23rd, 1906. This is very early. It's a very important letter. As you have noticed, it is possible that my reservation about your far-reaching views are due to a lack of experience. But don't you think that a number of borderline phenomena might be considered more appropriately in terms of the other basic drive, hunger, for instance, eating, sucking, predominantly hunger, kissing, predominantly sexual? Two complexes existing at the same time are always bound to coalesce psychologically, so that one of them invariably contains constellated aspects of the other. Perhaps you mean no more than this. In that case, I have misunderstood you and would be entirely of your opinion. Even so, however, one feels alarmed by the positivism of your presentation. So this is an early, this is right at the very beginning, and it's got two or three things in it that I'll point out to you. One, he's saying, do we really think that nursing, sucking, is a sexual experience for an infant? Do we really want to define it that way? Now, the other thing that I'll point out, if you can see my marker here, two complexes existing at the same time are always bound to coalesce psychologically. This is an interesting little side comment here, because what he's saying is that, yes, you can have a sexual complex and you can have some other kind of complex, say, associated with hunger, if one or the other of them is strong enough, or if they're in, so to speak, in proximity to one another, they will bleed into each other, and over time, the eating complex might begin to look more sexually related. So it's an interesting way in which he's thinking about how the complexes relate to one another. Now, yes, I can't see anyone right now, so.
I think you're okay to continue, George. Someone just had their mic unmuted.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about symbols, because no word is probably more prominent in Jungian circles than talking about symbols. I'm going to go down here. So here's the distinction. Here's the way that Jung defines a symbol. The concept, this is from volume 6, which is symbols, which is the typology, psychological types, and at the back of psychological types, he has a long list of definitions. He defines the symbol as the concept of a symbol should, in my view, be strictly distinguished from that of a sign. Symbolic and semiotic meanings are entirely different things. Now, earlier on, he had a footnote in the main text where he says, I say semiotic in contrast to symbolic. What Freud terms symbols are no more than signs for elementary instinctive processes. But a symbol is the best possible expression for something that cannot be expressed otherwise than by a more or less close analogy. So here's an example of Jung talking about symbols in relation to archetypes. Again, this is a point where some confusion comes in. This is from the seminar on dreams. And one of the people in the seminar, Dr. Schlegel, says, do you identify the idea of archetypes with the idea of symbols, so that everything that has a symbolical value can be considered as an archetype? And Jung says, no, the symbol is an entirely different conception. I would call an archetype a symbol when it was functioning as a symbol, but it doesn't necessarily function that way. The word symbol has been very much misused. For instance, the Christian faith is symbolized by the cross, which means that the cross expresses something which cannot be expressed in any other terms. The Greek word symbolon means creed, and the term symbol in its original use also meant the creed. The original idea of the creed was not that now God is caught and we know exactly what he means. The actual creed is the nearest approach in a human way to certain intuitions and beliefs. The belief that God is the Father and the same person as the Son and the Holy Ghost, for instance. The great mysteries of life and eternity could be expressed only by symbols, and therefore they, symbols, were always sacred. Now, we had this question earlier on. Is everyone still there?
Yes, we are.
How do I get you back?
Just unshare the screen
Okay,
in Zoom.
we'll stop sharing for a moment. So let's talk for a moment then about a little more about signs and symbols. I also want to say something about the temporal orientation of the psyche, and we'll be getting close to our hour and a half. I'm perfectly happy to hang on, but others may not be. So here you have the very important distinction. It's one of the singular distinctions between Freud and Jung, is the nature, is the distinction between the sign and the symbol. Now, if you'll recall again back to the discussion of the unconscious, what I pointed out there on the Freudian side of the system is that the project of the analyst, and I'll go back to my slides here for a minute. So for Freud, the symbol, or we could say sign here, is a coded representation of repressed material in the unconscious. That means that the referent of the symbol or the sign is in principle knowable. In other words, if we went back to the question that right at the very beginning of why does the knife bother you? Freud would say, well, I know why it bothers him. It's because it's a phallic symbol. So the symbolic is reducible to translation into language. And this is the path to consciousness, to bring the repressed material back into consciousness, which is the project of the analysis, the process of restoring the relationship between repressed material and the original thought. So bringing it back, repressed material back into consciousness. Now, for Jung, the symbol is an autonomous entity within the domain of the psyche and is distinct from the sign. The referent of the symbol is fundamentally unknowable. The symbolic is not reducible. It's already its own best possible formulation. An analysis, then, is the process of transformation by way of the symbol. And it's moving, this is part of what gives us the temporal orientation of the psyche for that distinction between Jung and Freud. And these are the major distinctions that I was going to look at. The temporal orientation has to do with this idea that for Freud, repression is the primary mechanism. Repression takes place. Elements in the psyche are repressed, usually from childhood. And so the orientation of analysis is always retrospective. It's always looking back towards events that took place in the past and trying to unpack them. For Jung, and here's where the symbol as the best possible representation of something that is not at this point understood, has a forward-looking, a projective into the future, a future-oriented quality to it. So it pulls psyche into the future rather than moving it back towards the past. So how does this work? Now there's another aspect to this that is not inconsequential when you get to the question that I suspect will dominate this course, which is where does analytical psychology go? And what is analytical psychology's project overall? The introduction, we're talking about the cultural projects of analytical psychology and what role does it play in the world. One of the things that's interesting about Jung's theory of the symbol is that what I referred to in my book and elsewhere as the life cycle of the symbol. That the symbol starts out as the best possible representation of something that is not understood. So there's some kind of a gap between our understanding and the role that the symbol is playing. Jung will argue as a historical matter that over time, symbols lose their numinous quality. They lose the ability to continue referring to something that is unknown through interpretation, through historical development, and so on. eventually they turn into signs. And this causes a serious problem in a culture, because then you don't have the symbolic container for the numinous experiences that derive from the collective unconscious. And you will, if you go back, for example, to the beginnings of Christianity, arguably the ancient Greco-Roman religions, the symbol systems that had sustained that culture for probably thousands of years had begun to break down, and a new symbolic system was needed in order to once again signify the numinous qualities of the archetypal dimensions of culture, or the archetypal dimensions of psyche. This is basically Jung's argument for the emergence of a new image of the self in the Christ figure, or in Asia, in the Buddhist, in Buddha, and so on. And it plays itself out in other settings that perhaps aren't quite as dramatic as that. But one has to ask the question, then Jung would say, is whether or not Jung felt that the Christian era, the symbolism was breaking down. He talks about this quite explicitly in the Zofingia lectures, which were lectures that he gave to the fraternity. He was a member of the Zofingia Society when he was still at university at Basel. Is that the numinous quality of the tradition was breaking down. The symbolism was no longer significant, and it was being taken over in that instance by less profound elements within the tradition, ethics and things like that. And so that the symbol, we come to various points in cultural development where symbol systems break down, and the project becomes one of restoring a symbolic environment. It's not something that you can do by planning it. It will have to emerge on its own, that symbolic dimension. So
I think we're almost out of time, George.
Yep. And I hate, these things never quite work out right for me.
No, the content has been really engaging. Everybody has been really enjoying it.
Well, I hope it's at least been helpful. And I don't like necessarily promoting my own stuff. My book goes over a lot of this material. I would encourage you, if you're interested in a very important aspect of the Freud-Jung relationship, the book by Patrick van der Meersch is a wonderful read, and goes over a lot of this material in a very clear and substantive way, and the question particularly around religion and psychosis, which we're only beginning to approach at this point. Okay?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, George. I did just want to quickly let everybody know that if you go to the learning modules under module 1, there's a suggested reading, and there's a very detailed list that George has given us for additional reading, including the Patrick van der Meersch website and book that he just mentioned. So you can find all that there. I'll make sure to post some information on the course homepage as well for where you can find that information.
Sure. Very
Thank
good.
you. Thank you, Gallery, and thank you, George, and thank you everyone for this very, initial launch. George, thank you. You covered a tremendous amount of terrain, and I'd like to leave you maybe with a question, because I think what resonates here is this distinction you're making relative to sign and symbol. That's foundational, as you're saying, to understanding part of the difference, the theoretical difference between Jung and Freud. I know Jung defined a symbol at one point as that which is pregnant with meaning.
Mhm.
So, you know, how does a symbol then turn into a sign? You know, once it's given birth, once we're given birth to it and we wring the meaning out of it, you know, it has a lifespan. And I'm going back to your idea of that movement from perception to apperception as a spectrum. And even though Jungian psychology does not have a developmental model, can you address perhaps Jung's idea of individuation as encompassing that movement from perception to apperception? That's one question. And the second question I have is, you didn't bring this word into it, but it's Jung's and Freud's distinctive understanding of the unconscious, where, you know, Freud, as you being very reductive, sees it as a repression, as the trash bin on our computer screen, right? Where we repress all those things we don't want to. Whereas Jung opens it up to give us an understanding of the unconscious and the creative unconscious in working with the symbolic. So my question is the symbolic and the way that the unconscious works and speaks a symbolic language, is that a part of what moves us along that spectrum from perception to apperception? Is the symbolic, in fact, that vehicle which helps move us towards and along that current of individuation that Jung talks about?
Well, yes, in this way, if you take if you take Christianity as a model, and I'm not doing that because for any particular, my own personal background is very heavily, my original field of study was Asian philosophy and modern Japanese philosophy, so all over the map on this. But you see, it is this process of excavation, you might say. In other words, if you look at the history of Christianity, you know, with the first 400 years, up in 400 or 500 years, up until you get Augustine and the Second Council of Nicaea and things like this, there's a huge project going on of trying to figure out what are we talking about when we talk about God and Jesus, and who are they? How does this all fit together? And it's a very creative process, and it's pulling psyche into this space. Then after that, after you get that sort of orthodox interpretation of these things, it goes on from there. Centuries of trying to work out what are we talking about with these symbols. What happens, though, what Jung would say, and I agree with him on this, is that through that process, hermeneutical process of interpreting the symbol, but also the development of the culture that comes along with it, the sciences and so on, eventually you reach a point, this is what his argument was in the Zofingia lectures, where those numinous symbols have lost their numinosity, and the system begins to break down. So you get a really cyclical view of the emergence of, and of course, what does he call the Christ image or the Buddha? These are self images. These are the self being, of course, as he puts it in one place, the superordinate organizing principle of the psyche. This is the self, capital S, sometimes is the overall organizing principle. And it will move then the organization. So the organization of Western culture for the last 2,000 years, and Jung actually does think along the lines of the Platonic year of 24,000 years, 2,000 years, month cycles, and so on. This is where he gets into the astrological thinking about these things. Won't go down that road right now, but that as you come to the end of the viability of a given symbol system, new symbols will have to present themselves. Where people can make a mistake is thinking that, okay, let's trot out and make up the symbol system that we're going to use. And it doesn't quite work that way. It's got to be a more organic thing. Now, individuation is a different subject here, at least is the way that I would think about it. what Jung is concerned about with individuation is that the unconscious, now thought of in Jungian terms, we become trapped in the unconscious dimensions of our life. And so, not exactly by way of repression, but he'll say the first thing that you have to work with is the shadow. Okay?
Mhm.
So the shadow, almost by definition, resides in the unconscious, but it influences the archetypal. The complexes and the archetypes will always impinge on ego consciousness.
But would you say that there's a correlation between Freud's repressed material and Jung's shadow?
Again, it's one of those things that looks a little bit like it. They're not entirely disconnected, but the shadow has this influence. It's not a question of releasing the repression so much as it is letting our knowledge of the shadow side, or the animus, or the archetypal in general, become sufficiently present to consciousness that they no longer affect us. We are able to separate ourselves from their influence and establish ego consciousness as independent of their unconscious influence on us. So going back to my example of the mother complex, that's also informed by the archetypal mother. Let's say the negative side, the destructive side of the mother archetype. Remember, the archetypes have two dimensions to
I tend to want to talk about the destructive side of the mother archetype, though. Very rarely do I hear conversations about the generative side.
Well, I can talk about the generative side, but in either case, you don't want the archetype to be well, this is probably why, frankly, thinking about the negative side is more consequential in some ways, because being able to separate that from the mother is going to alter the way in which you see that relationship.
To separate out the archetypal that's rooted in a complex will transform the relationship.
Transforms the relationship, and I've certainly seen that happen.
Yeah. And one last question, and then I want to get to
individuation is this matter of being oneself not under the influence, or not being trapped in the influence of the archetypal.
Right. But when we read the Red Book, what we see in Jung's own process is his engagement with the symbolic that motivates and is, I think, a vehicle for his own individuation, both personally and later on in what he went on to develop into a psychology.
Well, it's a little tricky, because if you look at the early parts of the Red Book, when he gets to Sophia, Salome and Elijah, one of the first things they say to him is, "We're not symbols."
Right.
They're very emphatic about that. I think that
we're living beings.
Yeah, we're living beings. We're real. Now that gets us into a whole nother dimension of fiddling around with Jung and the collective unconscious and what he refers to, I think correctly, the reality of the psyche.
But isn't that endemic to the understanding of a symbol, according to Jung, is that we don't see it as a symbol that is codified and defined. We have to engage with it as a living, active, dynamic entity.
Well, like you said,
in that sense, I would say they are symbols in the true sense of how Jung defined a symbol.
Well, this is an area that I think is fascinating. It's very curious what you get into with on that side of things, and I'm not sure that as he says in that one quotation that I have from the Dream Seminar, don't confuse archetypes and symbols. Symbols work in a particular way.
Mhm. Yeah.
And they do certain things. And that's why the cross, for example, he remarks on symbolon there, that the symbolon is the earliest one early form of a symbolon was taking a coin and breaking it in two. And when the two pieces came together, you confirmed the legitimacy of somebody if you're transmitting money, for example, and that it binds these things together. So it how symbols really work and how it means to work with symbols is I'm not trying to be evasive, but I think it's beyond the time limit that we have right now.
We could do a whole series. In fact, I think there have been series, so maybe that's to be continued. Sign and symbol, that could be a fascinating.
I have a whole theoretical development and a whole bunch of papers on what I call symbolic density.
Mm.
That there is and this gets into the work that I've done primarily in the last several years around how symbols can be seen. Different symbols carry how they carry meaning, the density of the symbolic.
And then also, I think looking at not just a symbol as defined by the culture, but the numinosity of a symbol also relates directly to each of our own direct experience with that. Within Christianity, I think one of the ways that the early Christians sought to hold on to that numinosity, even in the face of an orthodox codification of religion, was the Holy Spirit. And was the engagement of the Holy Ghost. So we could continue this. We have one last question I want to allow. He's been waiting patiently with his hand raised. Is it Fedor? And thank you everyone for hanging on with us. And then we're going to have to wrap this up for today.
Question?
Yeah, thank you very much. I was thinking about this dynamic that's every symbol is becoming a sign sooner or later. And what I'm thinking about is, are there any real symbols left in the modern world, in your opinion? I mean, like the role of religion is not the same as it was before, and it feels like in the modern world, in this postmodern concept, we are losing this humanist dimension and having more signs than symbols around us.
No, that I think that's largely accurate, and I think it's a very serious problem. I mean, if you want to talk about why. No, so sometimes you can have these the real question, I think, for the contemporary world is, are we on the cusp of a really major shift in symbolic systems like you had 2,000 years ago, say, or are we on the cusp of a more of a shorter one? For example, you can say that a book that I always recommend to people is Barbara Tuchman's book on the beginning of World War I called The Guns of August. But she starts out with a very symbolic moment there, which is the funeral of the King of England, Edward the Sixth or Seventh or something like that, in 1911, when all of the kings of Europe show up for the funeral. And as she says in the book, it's the last time they'll all be together, because World War I starts and that entire structure of authority in Europe is wiped out at that point. And all of that. and you have to rebuild some kind of system of authority and symbolic significance and so on and so forth. And that's basically what happens up through World War II. That's a shorter term experience as opposed to Christianity 2,000 years. Is there a symbol? I'm only going to respond to that by bringing up a man who I have a great deal of regard for. He's a theoretical biologist, very profound man by the name of Stuart Kauffman. And he will tell you, he'll say, Stuart Kauffman will say that he's basically an atheist in terms of established religions, but he has a wonderful little book called At Home in the Universe, where he says where from his point of view, it's a proposal, you might say, that you can Immanuel Kant said there are two things that create wonder in our lives: the moral law within and the starry sky above. And Kaufman sort of says, if you really allow the approach to the universe that to become in its a more, if you will, cosmic symbolic system, you can reestablish a sense of the numinous. That's basically what his argument is in that book.
George, thank you. I'm sorry we have to bring this to a close. I'm reading the comments in the chat bar. I'm on with everyone. I could go on with this for another couple of hours, more to be continued. So George, thank you so much for bringing your tremendous scholarship and depth and breadth of work to this first session in this series. If this is any indication, everyone, this is going to be just an amazing 9 months of learning with some of the best minds out there, in my opinion, at least, in the Jungian world. So thank you. Thank you to Stefano. Thank you to Pacifica Graduate Institute, and to all of you. We will see you next month, right? All right, everyone. Thank you, George. Have a wonderful week. Goodbye, all.
Bye. Thanks, Laura Lee.